Dying Light 2 is an interesting game. I use the word interesting very deliberately, as what I like about it can't always be quantified as good, and what I dislike about it shouldn't always be quantified as bad. Techland's sequel to 2015's first-person parkour-based zombie survival game, Dying Light, is set in the same world as the original, but with the timeline rolled forward a handful of years, where the infection has mutated further. Crane, the original game's protagonist, is name-dropped in the opening segments here, but for this, you control Aiden, a pilgrim who acts as a courier between isolated human settlements, bringing supplies or messages to the remnants of humanity. Remnants is definitely the right word too, as you get the impression that a vast wilderness exists with sporadic survival camps dotted around the wilderness. That environment is shown early on, but the majority of the story follows Aiden after he arrives in the city of Villador, while searching for his sister, Mia. The player learns about Aiden's past as an unwilling participant in mad science experiments, and the man responsible for Mia's disappearance. Aiden's story itself is fairly cliché for this type of game. His past as a test subject easily explains his durability and superhuman athletic abilities, and the two groups he meets early on are the usual tropes of liberal idealist and oppressive fascists, par for the course. Let me open by saying that this is a very good looking game. This engine is well utilised when it comes to visuals. In fact, had I not played the more linear and much shorter Guardians of the Galaxy game last year, it's safe to say that this would be the best looking game I'd ever played. With this improved visual quality comes some serious overhead in the form of performance, and this was not a game that let me turn any of the dials hard to the right on 4K. Unless you're running a top-end enthusiast card, 4K is actually out of the question if you want higher or better graphics settings, even with DLSS on. This visual design translates well to the storytelling though, as Dying Light 2 does a good job of presenting its characters and NPCs on screen. However, the characters themselves are a bit of a mixed bag. The cast around Sophie complements her well and helps sell the massive chip on her shoulder, but none of them are deeper than a puddle. Her peacekeeper counterpart, Iko, has no such ensemble, and none of his subordinates are given much more than a second of screen time before their stories play out. His character is developed through his family a little later in the game, but it's far too late at that point. You've already made up your mind about him. This game seemed determined to move on from characters that you do meet very quickly, but I kind of like how the game handles the eccentric craftsman Alberto and his son, short though your time with those is. These are not the game's intended stars, but they are certainly strong characters and are well done that at least keep your attention while you're doing these stories. The handling of the supposed stars is a real weakness. I liked Hakon, who is your early sidekick character, as he served a gameplay function and his dialogue was a good mix of entertaining and useful. However, he's just shuttled out of the game at the halfway point with very little ceremony, and a justification that felt forced and contrived to the point where I almost put my controller down. If that's the reveal you're going for, do it just before the game's denouement, 10 hours later than it actually was. What follows is the game's attempt to almost recast that sidekick role at the halfway mark, replacing Hakon with Luan, the edgy female badass that modern games copy and paste like a rejection letter at a recruitment agency. You're around halfway through the game at the point when she's shuttled in and Hakon out, having to undergo another set of character development arcs and meet an entirely new crew and cast. Unfortunately, this leaves neither story half A or story half B with enough time to actually let me get to know these characters in meaningful organic ways. Instead, you're just getting exposition dumps. In terms of gameplay, Dying Light 2 is split up into two main elements, combat and parkour. As a first-person RPG in the mold of Far Cry and Fallout, you'd think range combat should be at the forefront, but here it's melee combat that rules the roost. In a change from the first game, guns aren't just late game, they're absent, aside from two gimmick guns that are more accessory than anything else. As such, what you're focusing on is up-close maiming and smashing. From this close vantage point, you get a front row seat to the spectacle of a visceral and bloody melee combat system, which only gets better as you unlock more weapon mods. The parkour side utilises this point of view a little better, more organically, particularly as you scale the heights of buildings and towers. This viewpoint really does contribute to a more immersive experience when walking across a narrow beam hundreds of meters in the air, or when darting across the rooftops. There's a very Mirror's Edge feel to this, and both combat and parkour get significantly better when you start to invest skill points into their respective trees. In terms of progression, there are two main avenues. First is the aforementioned skill point system, which are split into combat and parkour. You gain each from performing actions under their own banner, and both for finishing quests or encounters in the world. Each skill has a health or stamina threshold that you need to meet, and these stats are improved by looting inhibitors, which are found in some of the more dangerous areas of the world. Overall, these stats contribute to your level, which affects what level of gear drops in the world, and whether or not you can insta-kill certain enemies with takedowns. More points can be earned at night, when the enemies are stronger, and the majority of these skills increase your ability to avoid, escape, or kill the infected. The other avenue of progression is the RPG gear and stat elements that make this game feel less like an action game and more like a light looter. I don't believe comparisons to Borderlands, Diablo, or Destiny are appropriate. This is much more like Divinity or Assassin's Creed Odyssey in terms of how loot works. Each piece of gear provides stats which lean Aiden slightly towards one class within the game. From what I can tell, most of these suggest a greater focus on a specific playstyle, such as using one-handed melee weapons or ranged weapons. Early on, you don't have access to any ranged weapons, so these classes come more into their own after the midpoint, when you have access to a wider range of things that you can loot, such as weapons and gear. While I like a lot of these RPG mechanics, they feel unnecessary and out of place here. It feels like the same equipment and consumable systems could have been implemented without the need for these looter rarity mechanics. While other zombie games promote a feeling of deprivation and restricting the resources available to the player, this does never seem to be the case here. In fact, I was barely 10 hours in before I was wishing for a loot all button. The game appears to be sitting on the fence between becoming a fully stat-based game that gives the player a power trip with gear and rare weapons worth fighting for, and the attritional nature of survival horror, where weapons and items are scarce and ephemeral. In this implementation, weapons have a durability meter, and regardless of their rarity, they will break and become useless. Rarer weapons do last longer and can have their durability restored by attaching mods, but eventually, they too will break, and you cannot repair anything indefinitely. Knowing that you always need to be thinking about your next weapon was a very Breath of the Wild design choice, but with weapons being randomly acquired here, it doesn't work the same way. As such, you have to juggle crafting to make consumable items and manage weapon durability, and that makes up a large portion of the gameplay loop, placing an unnecessarily large burden upon crafting and upgrading blueprints. I believe this strongly clashes with the nature of the rarity-based loot system, as it devalues finding a legendary or artifact level weapon. You never get that cool new toy feeling, because from day one, you know it's going to be useless at some point. Items that shouldn't feel like consumables, therefore do. Where Dying Light 2 drops the ball a second time is that these loot and level systems feel very artificial. At level 4, I can get the drop on a standard enemy, sneak up behind them, and be unable to kill them because they're level 5. Yet a level 4 enemy will just die with the snap of my fingers. This feels immersion breaking in the same way it did for Assassin's Creed Origins, when you couldn't kill an enemy you'd successfully caught off guard by sticking a knife in their throat. These enemies are not protected by any specific thing or ability, they're protected by a number above their head, and that's nowhere near as immersive as it ought to be. I did find other parts of this system work just fine. Unlocking inhibitors and boosting your stamina and health works, because finding these items wasn't always straightforward. I like how a lot of the open world activities respawn quickly, so you can loot valuables and crafting materials again. This seems to be used in a way that you always have the money or resources to buy a weapon from a vendor and never be without one. Money can also be spent alongside trophies dropped from fallen enemies to upgrade blueprints, which feeds back into the aforementioned gameplay loop. But this exposes the issue further. The game knows it cannot deprive you of any other resource as a result of breakable weapons, and because it doesn't, you never get that sense of helplessness. Later on, Aiden unlocks some of the traversal powers, including a paraglider, which is almost a necessity for exploring the second half of the city. Most, if not all of my deaths in this game were from fall damage or being knocked off the edge of a building or tower. The verticality this injected into the game was impressive, and the paraglider gives skilled players a second chance to make up for a mistake or a misjudged jump. While the verticality of this second area is certainly impressive, another area of the game I can give a lot of praise to is the facial animation and graphics. This is without a doubt a very pretty game, and the character models are excellent. The lip syncing here is a little off, but it's by no means atrocious. Ultimately, the game does a good job visually, even if I couldn't get it to run smoothly on max settings. And it's clear this engine does what Techland intended for it to do, create and maintain this world well. In fact, I'm of the opinion that Dying Light 2 is not poorly optimized at all. Rather, that the ceiling for graphical fidelity here is so high that it might be one of the few games in existence that can currently justify owning a 3090. In conclusion, Dying Light 2 suffers from an identity crisis. It's a game that has strong roots in the similar vein as the Far Cry games that peaked with Far Cry 3, yet they've managed to expand that here without making the playable area so overwhelmingly vast that it becomes a chore. A handful of interesting characters exist, but mostly as figures on the periphery of the story, and everyone thrust into a starring role suffers from the same kind of dull, lifeless box checking that is usually reserved for silent protagonists in JRPGs. The jarring switch of sidekick characters at the midpoint robs the player of their emotional anchor in a way that left me seriously wondering If the game was originally intended to be much shorter and conclude after the end of the first area, the day-night cycle has been improved upon and lets players choose their own difficulty level by tackling certain content outside of the recommended hours, while the weapon degradation system and usable consumables benefit those who hoard and loot everything. The lack of guns is explained in a side quest, when I do think this needed to be front and center in the main story, and early on, to make people realise that this is not a world they're going to be firing anything anytime soon. Poor availability of good ranged weapons throughout really funnels the player to specific builds, despite systems that feel as though they were intended to promote build diversity. The game's greatest failure is that it is not bad, not at all. It was solid on launch, and I saw very little in the way of glitches or bugs. The number of options available within the settings menus point towards a competent dev cycle and smart choices behind the scenes when it comes to testing. Yet, I can't help but feel this game has been designed to have the most safe, generic appeal possible, and it takes systems and mechanics from other successful and popular titles and bolts them onto this. I'd liken it to a chef who couldn't decide which herb to season a dish with and instead chose mixed spices. It's not a meal that tastes bad, but it might be underwhelming if you were expecting an explosion of flavour. This is a more dense and urban environment than other open world games, and without a doubt, this is very visually impressive. However, with February and March stacked to the brim with games that are likely to have a bit more of a wow factor, it seems to me that it's worth waiting for this to go on sale. It's not special enough to justify taking up time in what is a very busy release window.